Good day, students. My name is Herschel Neyrovitz, and I will be presenting Study Unit 10, Successful Aging and Mental Health. Here we just have the 4 outcomes. Please go through all of them to make sure you are familiar with them. Alright, so on this slide we will be looking at what is successful aging. Alright, at first you might think it's a very straightforward concept. You know, the older you get, the more years you add on, the more successful you've aged. But it's a little bit more complex than that and also a little bit more controversial. Alright, so the idea of aging successfully or successful aging was done by two theorists or two scientists, John W. Rowe and Robert L. Kahn, and they proposed a 3 components idea of what exactly it is to age successfully. So the first one being the absence of disease and disease-related disabilities, excuse me. So this is basically where you are aging without any major chronic illnesses or conditions that can limit your functioning in any way. But it's quite strict because if you think about it, there are very, very few elderly people who do not have any health conditions, any chronic health conditions. So it's a normal part of aging. The second one is maintaining high cognitive and physical functioning. So this is basically, are you still able to think clearly? Can you still solve complex problems? Can you remain independent and by yourself? And are there any other things that you can still manage physically, like daily tasks? And then the final one is active engagement or participation in social productive activities. All right, so this will also include anything with regards to maintaining relationships, participating in the community activities, or even continuing to work with meaningful roles. So in essence, it's not just about living longer, but if we look at it, it's more about your quality of life that you have. Does failure in one of the above mean you have not aged successfully? Alright, so in order to answer that question, please stop the video here, go to Ifundi and answer question 1 under Study Unit 10. Alright, you've answered question 1, let's quickly look at question 2. According to the textbook, there are 9 factors that may affect successful aging. Please list them below in the same order they are in your textbook. Remember to answer this on Ifundi under Study Unit 10. Alright, so you've listed all the different factors. There are 9 of them. You should have listed all 9 of them in the correct order. That's in the textbook. I'm quickly going to go through a few of them so you have a very good idea of what they are. The first one is attitudes towards age. Now this is usually other people's attitudes towards age. Alright, and this is usually based on discrimination. But it's discrimination based towards age or elderly, or the older the person is, the more they get discriminated against. Right, and this is usually very subtle, it's not obvious, so it's not going to be clear-cut bullying that you would see very easily. It's often very, very subtle, and you can see this where people speak to, elders or the elderly in a very patronizing way, or the elderly get overlooked for opportunities. They don't want to get employed, or they don't want to employ the elderly for specific jobs, for example. And they're also assumed to be less capable. Even if there's no evidence to say that they can't do something, people tend to believe that they can't do something. Alright, there's also very close stereotypes that are linked with ageism. So stereotypes are your generalized beliefs about a group of people, so in this case the elderly, especially negative and inaccurate kind of generalizations or beliefs that are made. A few common ones that we see is older people are all the same, they are like children, they're always ill or frail, they are lonely just waiting to die, they are senile or cognitively impaired. So you can see that a lot of these are just wrong. Alright, they're not correct, it's not how it is, but people think they are that way, and sometimes it does tend to shape their behavior in the elderly. Now, we've looked at how other people view aging. What about the person themselves that's busy aging? And this is where the personality comes in. So personality traits plays an important role. Alright, you remember we learned about the big 5 traits in Study Unit 9. Some of them come through here as well, but we're also looking at a whole bunch of others. But the important aspect to realize is that this is about the internal characteristics of the individual. So how they think, feel, and respond to life over time. So what we know, if we look at research, is that it consistently shows that certain personality traits are associated with better adjustment and well-being in late adulthood. So depending on which traits you have, this can help you to age more successfully. If we look at a strong sense of meaning, obviously if you have a strong sense of meaning, it means you have purpose and value in life, and this helps you to remain psychologically engaged, even in the face of like age-related challenges that you might have. The next one, a sense of mastery. So if you believe that you still have control over your life and you can, influence your life's outcomes, that's going to be very, very important, because the more you lose control, or the more you believe you lose control, the more it's detrimental. So this acts as a protective factor if you have a sense of mastery over your own life. Emotional stability is very, very important. Here we can also look at low levels of neuroticism, if we want to state it like that. Basically, it just means you are less prone to anxiety or mood swings or stress, and it supports better coping, with health changes or life transitions like retiring or, moving out of your lifehood home. Flexibility is the next one. So obviously, if individuals are able to adapt to their circumstances, specifically when there's change, like I said, retirement or physical limitations or shifting roles, if they're able to be flexible and to adapt, it will also help them to age more successfully. Goal-directedness, it keeps individuals, future-orientated, thinking about their future and what they still want to achieve, specifically later in life. Doesn't matter how big or small these goals are, it just promotes, some form of motivation and engagement within the elderly. Then we have conscientiousness. All right, and this is linked to responsible behavior. All right, so remember we talked about conscientiousness. If your room is, neat and tidy, you have a study plan, everything's organized, you are likely high in conscientiousness, and this can help you to maintain health routines when you get older, adhering to taking your medication when you need to, making good lifestyle choices. All right, so that's one of the factors that helps you to live a little bit longer or more successfully. Let me put it like that rather. Extroversion, so this supports more social engagement, speaking to people, which is then linked to well-being, which obviously also reduces your loneliness. I mean, the more people you interact with, the less lonely you might be. Low hostility levels. All right, so this is also important. If you want to age successfully or live a good quality life, lower hostility is much more effective in helping you. So chronic anger, cynicism, those can negatively affect both your physical and your mental health. And then finally, resilience. All right, and your ability to bounce back from difficult situations or adversities. But this is one of the most powerful predictors of successful aging. Just think about two individuals who are both about to retire at the same age. One sees a retirement as a loss of purpose, withdraws, and then they completely struggle to adapt, so they have no flexibility. And the other one sets new goals, he joins social groups and adapts to their routine. The difference here is not the situation. It's mainly, you can see it's the person's personality traits, as well as their coping styles in a way, that shapes, how they experience this change and how they interpret it and how they manage it. So that's very, very important. You can see the differences in those two. Remember, personality also links to Erikson's theory. So if we go and look at late adulthood, this is the integrity versus despair stage, and this is usually where they reflect on their lives. So you can see how personality traits play a role. Individuals with, if they were high in resilience, they had good emotional stability, they had a strong sense of meaning, they're much more likely to experience integrity. But those that have maybe the opposite personality traits, they might be a bit more in despair about their life. Okay, our next key psychological factor that influences successful aging is the locus of control. Very simply said, this is where people believe control, it's where they believe the control in their lives come from. All right, so it's the extent where they think, do they have control over their own life experiences and their own outcomes, or do they not to a certain extent? So there's two main types: an internal locus of control, internal meaning within you. So this is where the individuals believe that their behavior and outcomes are, mostly or largely determined by their own actions, their own decisions, and their own efforts. Whereas on the opposite side, the external locus of control, obviously external meaning outside, this is where people or individuals believe that the outcomes the outcomes of their lives are determined by outside forces. So things outside of them, such as luck, fate, or other people or circumstances, everything that's beyond their control. All right, this becomes very important if we look at late adulthood. plays a role in many different areas. As they get older, they may experience health challenges, loss of independence, changes in social roles. All of these can, lead to some sort of a shift towards a more external locus of control. If, specifically if they genuinely have less control over certain aspects of their lives. But if we also look at the concept of self-efficacy, this is a bit more about the person's belief in their ability to successfully perform specific tasks. So while the locus of control is about general control over life, self-efficacy is a little bit more about, can I do this specific thing? If we take an example, an older adult might feel they cannot control aging itself, which is an external locus of control, but they can still believe they can manage the exercise routine or their medication. So that means they would have a high self-efficacy. So then, so far we focused a lot on a lot of internal, psychological kind of factors, personality, locus of control. But if we want to look at other factors that also influence successful aging, not all of them are always internal. Some of them can be shaped by external conditions, specifically socioeconomic circumstances. All right, so here we refer to things as income, access to healthcare, living conditions, education, social opportunities. These are all influenced by socioeconomic conditions in their lives. To give you an example, poverty can introduce high levels of uncertainty about the future. So if you're older, you might worry about affording healthcare, meeting your basic needs, maintaining independence. These are all ongoing uncertainties that can contribute to a sense of hopelessness. The feeling that things are unlikely to improve. Over time, this can also develop into what we call learned helplessness. So this is very much a term where individuals are repeatedly exposed to situations where they have little control, and they begin to believe that nothing they do will make a difference. Even in situations where they actually do have some sort of control, they'll still believe that they can't do anything. All right. Another important consequence of socioeconomic disadvantage as well, alienation from mainstream society. This is basically where the elderly might feel disconnected, or they might be excluded or not valued by society. And this often affects their mental health, their sense of identity, and overall well-being in late adulthood very negatively. They often struggle to adapt. It's quite difficult for them. All right, so looking at this little slide here, we can see it kind of links to the next factor, dependency. When we are born, we are extremely dependent, goes over to independent for the majority of our life, and then as we get older, it leans back to dependency again. Now, dependency is often viewed as negative. People don't want to be dependent, everybody wants to be independent. But in reality, if we look at it, it's a bit more complex than just, the one or the other. It's very much on a continuum. So there's different kinds of dependency, and they can affect aging in different ways. So if we look at it in late adulthood, if we're not referring to just one thing, there are usually multiple dimensions, multiple areas that we look at. The first one being physical and medical dependence. So obviously self-explanatory, an individual's physical health allows them to function on their own. We look at things like mobility limitations or chronic illnesses that may increase reliance on others. For example, if you think of somebody that can't walk anymore, they need to be in a wheelchair. So there's obviously going to be a form of physical dependence there. Psychological dependency, the next one, this is where we look at cognitive and emotional functioning. This includes, your ability to make decisions, regulate your emotions, and cope with all the challenges on your own. Think about it, the older you get, if you're not able to make decisions, especially things like financial decisions, this can become quite strenuous, so you might become a bit more dependent there. Next, social dependency. So do you need somebody to help you maintain relationships and receive support, or are you still able to do it on your own? You still have that ability. Now, some level of social dependency is actually normal and beneficial. So humans are inherently social, meaning we do want to have some form of social dependency. Doesn't matter how introverted you are, we do need a little bit of social interactions every now and then. And then finally, financial dependency. So this basically depends on if the individual can support themselves, financially, economically, or if they need help from, family members. I think this all plays a role with regards to savings and retirement funds and those kind of things. Was the individual able to save and build up a retirement fund, or were they just working every day, from hand to mouth, and they couldn't save up, and now they are dependent financially on others or family members or grants, those kind of things. Next, we can look at the next two relatively quickly. Major life events and daily hassles. So major life events include things like retirement or the loss of a spouse or friends or health-related challenges. But with the major ones, there's also just daily hassles, the smaller challenges. Things like managing health conditions, completing daily tasks like going shopping. For you, if you need to go shopping, very easy. You go to the shops however you need to, get what you need to, and then you come back. But this might not be possible if you're older, especially if there's physical dependencies as well. You also have to navigate around having reduced energy and mobility. It just gets a lot more tougher, specifically if you think of study unit 8 and the changes in physical development. These all play a very big role, and can also lead to chronic stress. If you think about how stressed you become if you can't go to the shops whenever you'd want to go. All right. So it's not just the big life events, but it's often the smaller ones. And it's often the add up of smaller ones. The next thing is active lifestyle, or active aging, that we also refer to it as. This is where you're staying physically active, remaining mentally engaged, continuing social involvement. So it doesn't necessarily mean just intense physical activity. It can just include, walking every day, chatting to your friends or your neighbors, participating in any form of hobbies that you might have, things that you enjoy, learning something new. I mean, you're never too old to learn something. It doesn't get easier, but it doesn't mean you can't do it. And then, so the main idea with the active lifestyle is that you continuously engage with life. You don't just sit at home and become a couch potato. Next, we look at religion and spirituality. So this also plays a significant role. It can influence their well-being in several ways. So, firstly, this does help to provide structure and meaning through beliefs, practices, and expectations. It can also act as a very good source of stress relief, especially in times of loss or uncertainty. And they also offer social support through communities and shared practices. And in most cases, I'm hoping in all cases, but in most cases, they promote a positive outlook on and hope, on life, specifically when it comes to age-related challenges. And then finally, we're looking at loneliness. All right, and it's very important that we don't confuse this with just simply being alone. All right, so there are two very different experiences, even though they may look similar from the outside. All right, so quickly go to Ifundi again. Just pause this video here and then just answer the question according to the textbook. What is the difference between loneliness and being alone? Once you've answered, you can just come back. All right, so welcome back. So now you've answered what's the difference between loneliness and being alone. Here's just a little aspect to help you, and that you can compare your answer to see how close you were. But loneliness is an unpleasant and distressing emotional state. This often involves feelings of emptiness, isolation, and disconnection. So you can see it's not very ideal. You can feel lonely even when you are surrounded by other people. All right. So it's not about the number of people around you, but it's about the quality of the connection that you have with people. All right. So that's very, very important to realize. You can have a lot of people, and they can all be your, friends, if I can say it like that, or family, but if there's no quality of connection, are they really there? And you can be extremely lonely in those situations. You can think of it as a pain of being alone, where aloneness, this is something else. All right, so it's in contrast, aloneness can be more of a positive and even a desirable experience. Okay, so think about it. This is how many of you, after you've been very social or been to a party or just been to class, after you just think, okay, I just need an hour or two just to be alone by myself and recharge. Nothing wrong with that, but it's your choice to be alone. All right, and it can involve your reflections, resting, emotional recovery, anything, but it's your choice to be alone. So you don't feel alone, but you choose to be alone. So it's not loneliness, but you are just alone because of a choice. And it's often seen as peaceful or even healing, to a lot of people. So Instead of distress, aloneness can bring you things like calmness, clarity, a sense of restoration. You can think of aloneness as, the joy of being alone. Here we just have a little illustration. Doesn't matter how many people there are around you, you can still be sad. All right. If you look at the illustration, it's not showing, but you'll see there's a little arrow and he gets a little sad face there. Oh, there we go. All right. Now we're going to go to 10.2, old age and mental health. So here we're going to quickly look at another question. So according to the textbook, what are some of the mental health issues the elderly often struggle with? All right, so please stop this and go to your textbook and read up and answer what are the different ones there, and answer this on your Fundi, please. Okay, so you might have seen one of them was mood disorders, from which we can look at depression. All right, here you can see the symptoms, intense sadness, decreased activity, weight loss, lack of sleep, feelings of guilt, poor concentration, and thoughts of death. All right, so these thoughts of death are often with regards to, dying or almost suicidal kind of thoughts, but this is where depression comes in. And this is one of the most common mental disorders that the elderly struggle with. Between 20 to 50% of them do. And it's usually comorbid with other illnesses, which also makes it often misdiagnosed, meaning people have depression but doesn't get diagnosed because they attribute it to other things. You can think about it. If you are losing your sense of hearing, if you're losing your sense of sight, you are unable to concentrate, or your memory is going and you can't remember things. All of these can contribute to depression. Doesn't necessarily mean it's causing it, but can definitely contribute. All right, sorry, that was from the previous slide. Okay. Anxiety disorders is one of the other ones. So it's an intense tension, distress, a physiological reaction such as palpitations and sweating. So you can see it's a very physiological bodily kind of reaction. There's a big group of anxiety disorders. I'm not going to discuss all of them, but you need to go read up on all of them. But this definitely influences your daily functioning. Okay, it's often caused by circumstances, medical conditions, and also medications or substances can definitely cause it. And it's very common within the elderly. You can think, the more older you get, the more frail you get, the more worried you get. Going to the shops isn't just about going to the shops. What if I fall and hurt myself and I can't get back up? So these are things that start contributing to anxiety. Delirium. Okay, so very important. You'll see there's delirium and another one, dementia. Don't confuse the two, please. Delirium is a state of confusion. So you have disturbances in your consciousness. You don't know which day it is. You can't remember your name. You have disorientation with memory. So your cognitions are affected. You have slurred speech. This often develops over a short period of time, but it's also temporary and usually goes away after a period of time once the causing factor is treated. The elderly are usually most vulnerable to delirium, and it is also associated with significant morbidity and mortality. Often those that are very close to death or close to passing away often become delirious just before they pass away as well. All right, and it's caused by medications, withdrawal, brain infections. So you can see anything can actually kind of cause it. The elderly are just more susceptible and more vulnerable to it, and therefore they experience it more often. Dementia, as I said, on the other side, this is an umbrella term for the group of mental disorders characterized by deterioration of the brain. All right, so your brain is literally, going backwards, breaking down, to say it very, very basically. You have impairment in memory, judgment, and reasoning, and this is permanent as well. All right, there's over 100 types of dementias. That's a lot. Alzheimer's is one of them that you might have heard about. All right, so there's over 100 types. And you will need to know each one of them for the exams. All right. I'm just joking. You don't need to know all of them, but you do need to know some of the main ones. For example, Alzheimer's, and you need to know what the dementias or what dementia is specifically as well. All right. So please don't go and study all 100 of them. You just need to know the basics. So yeah, if you're listening, well done. If not, good luck to those studying over 100 types of dementias. Okay, let's quickly go to question 4. According to the textbook, what is death? All right, so what is the definition of death? I'm going to see what the textbook says and then answer it on Ifundi. Pause your video and then come back once you're done. Right, welcome back. Same thing, question 5. What exactly, according to the textbook, is death anxiety? All right, So answer on Ifundi again, pause the video and look at your textbook, what does it say, and copy over into Ifundi what your textbook says. Question 6, according to the textbook, how many forms of death anxiety are there? Same thing, pause the video, check your textbook, write down your answers on Ifundi, please. We'll go and check them as well. Okay, then we have death and grief. All right, so you've answered question 4, 5, and 6, all related to death. If we look at death and grief, this is chapter 7 in your textbook. You'll see it becomes a lot more about actually dying now. All right, so death is often seen as a release from physical and emotional pain, but it's not always something that everybody looks forward to. So death anxiety is our anxiety of dying, but it gets split up into different types of death anxiety. Okay, the first one is fear of suffering, quite straightforward. So people are often afraid of pain or losing control, suffering in their last moments of life. Another one is the fear of isolation and loneliness. So you'll see, I don't know if you've ever gone to visit somebody who's on the process of passing away, but you don't quite feel normal or yourself when you're interacting with them. And this can make, the person who is busy passing away feel very lonely because everybody is very artificial, very or superficial, very different around them. It's not the same. So they can feel very, lonely and isolated. Then there's the fear of non-being, the next one. So this is just the anxiety of not existing anymore. All right, as soon as you pass, then you're gone. The next one is fear of failing goals. We all have goals, so not achieving them before you die is a fear that a lot of people experience. The fear of humiliation. So, how am I going to act when I die? Am I going to take it well, or am I going to humiliate myself during this whole process? Then the next one is the fear of impact on the loved ones. So obviously, if I'm passing away, who's going to look after my loved ones, the people that I'm leaving behind? All right, there's going to be, financial, emotional, psychological implications for the people who stay behind. So, being worried about that. Fear of punishment or the unknown. So, what happens if I die and I go to hell? Or I go to somewhere that I don't know? Something like that. And then the last one is the fear of death of others. Okay, so it's not always necessarily our own fear of dying, but what happens if my partner dies? What happens if my parents or my sibling dies? So it's not just your own fear, but the fear of other people also passing away. Okay, question 7. Use the textbook only to answer the following question. Using Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, explain how each stage would present in real life if experienced by the same individual. Okay, so in your answer, describe the thoughts, emotions, and behaviors associated with each stage using practical examples to illustrate your explanations. All right, so please use the textbook for this. It's very important, and your own words and everything to answer this question, and then we will elaborate it a bit more in our online class. Okay, but this is going to be the baseline what we're working from, so look in the textbook at what it says there and use that to answer this question. Okay, now that you've answered that question, here you can just quickly see what are the 5 stages. Yes, we will discuss them in a bit more detail when it gets to the online class, so please make sure you've completed the other question appropriately with your own aspects so we can see where you're struggling or what you don't understand. All right, and just last part that's important about the cycle. These cycles are not just limited to an individual that is dying. Other people experiencing grief can also go through them. It's also not a circular or a straightforward pattern, right? It can go in any order. It doesn't mean it has to follow from the one to the next to the next. It can jump around. Here's the same question again. Can you identify what each stage looks like, or what the symptoms or signs of each stage might look like in a person? All right, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in the online class.